É uma honra estar aqui hoje podendo falar com a Sunita Bhogal, autora, mas também psicoterapeuta integrativa transpessoal, que navega entre os mundos da ciência e também da alma. Ela mergulha em águas muito profundas da consciência, indo muito além da mente racional, costurando a psicologia moderna com a visão de mundo quântica. Especialista em traumas, a Sunita já escreveu diversas obras, sendo inclusive uma delas com a Amit Goswami, uma super referência dentro desse mundo da visão de mundo quântica, e também oferece diversos cursos aqui no Brasil através da Quantum Academy, a anfitriã desse evento em que a gente se encontra nesse momento, e a gente pode explorar um pouquinho desse conhecimento dela através disso, mas hoje a gente vai bater um papinho para esclarecer algumas questões que podem ser muito elucidativas. Hello!
Hey Layla!
How are you?
I'm good.
Great. So, having been such a linear and rational person coming from a mathematical background, could you go briefly over your journey into the self-development world, into this subjective aspects of healing and therapy and psychology and all of this?
Yeah, sure. So as you know, I have my background is in maths and science, super linear. I used to be actually super linear in the way that I thought. But you know, funnily enough, Layla, I was born, so I'm Indian. So, you know, because I was born into like an Indian religion, I actually kind of grew up with quite a rich spiritual life. So books like the Bhagavad Gita or the Guru Granth Sahib, you know, I was very kind of already sort of spiritually aware because I was brought up like that. And then I think it was probably, actually no, I was 19 years old when I first started kind of looking into spirituality a little bit deeper. And then in my 20s, I ended up with an eating disorder, unfortunately. And I think that was really my entry into kind of personal development. So it kind of started from there. And then, you know, and I was teaching at the time because I used to be a teacher. And then slowly, I kind of ended up studying psychotherapy more for myself in the beginning. And yeah, it kind of went from there. So I would say it's probably due to, you know, we say dark night of the soul. So I went through a really like difficult period and I guess I didn't really know where to turn and it kind of just developed from there. So started with the spirituality and then I guess having quite a scientific mind, kind of started looking at the links between the two.
So it was more of a moderate gradative shift and then it just aggravated when you went through the dark nights of the soul.
Correct, yeah.
That's nice. I think many of us go to these deep parts of life and we don't know how to deal with it. Well, take her example and find a whole new path. Well, how would you say your work on trauma relates to the quantic view of the world?
You know, that's a great question. So I think the first thing I would say is that when you actually begin to understand the quantum worldview, I think you'll start to understand that fundamentally, you know, the idea of the quantum worldview is that consciousness is the ground of all being, right? Mm-hmm. So technically, if you look at us as human beings, we are also energetic in nature. So I think really when you look at it from that perspective, we start off with the idea that we are actually, you know, consciousness is the ground of all being and we are actually energetic beings. So fundamentally, you know, this idea that we're kind of spiritual beings having a human experience kind of really coming into the lens. Yeah. And so I think that when you look at it from that perspective and then look at what trauma is, right, and layer that on top, that's the only way that I can explain it. Because if we're coming from like a very linear worldview, we tend to look at human beings and energy sometimes as two separate things. Like you look at the idea of duality, right? And when you do that, you tend to look at us as human beings and you look at trauma purely from the aspect of psychology. But when you look at us as consciousness as the ground of all being and we're energetic beings, and then you begin to understand that, hang on a minute, that means that on some level, like we're not just a physical body, we're a mind, we're emotions, physical body, we're energy. And then you look at the definition of trauma through that. It's like, oh, so when we have a traumatic experience, this is what happens in our mind and body, which we are, you know, again, kind of quantum in nature to some degree, right? Mm-hmm. And then when you look at it from that perspective, and then you look at, okay, so how can I heal this? That now it's within the healing then that the quantum worldview becomes really relevant because as you know, I tend to use energy psychology, so a lot of emotional freedom techniques, matrix reimprinting. So, you know, I'll often say to people that healing is really the journey about understanding. It's that fine line between your material self and the quantum self. You know, it's that delicate dance between like your immanent mind, your ego mind, and your transcendent kind of quantum mind. And it's about understanding how to use those two different aspects in order to work with, understand, work with, and fundamentally heal trauma.
Perfect. So my next question was actually going to be, how can spirituality contribute to the therapeutical process of healing trauma and reprogramming belief systems? But I think you kind of went over this. So the question is, can you relate spirituality to the quantum worldview? Would you say they are allies, or they're the same thing? How do you see spirituality connected to the quantum worldview?
I think that's a great question. And I think that really kind of depends on what a person's definition of spirituality is. Because I think spirituality, can be used by somebody who is aligned with the quantum worldview. It can also be used by somebody who might not be aligned with the quantum worldview. So I think the first question is, what does spirituality mean to a person, right? Okay. However, if you're asking me about potentially what my view on spirituality is, well, I think for me, and this is really what the book, the O Poder da Mente that, I wrote, I think the first few chapters in that was really my exploration into the link between science, healing and spirituality, right? So for me, it was about understanding fundamentally, before I could answer the question that you're asking, actually, what is the link for me? What was the link between science and spirituality? Like, what were some of the spiritual scriptures saying? And what anecdotal and empirical evidence did we have? Do we have that was backing that up? So research, for example, in near-death experiences, in parapsychology, in transpersonal psychology. So it's really taking a multidisciplinary approach, having a look at how that aligns with what my version of like spirituality or the spiritual texts were, and then kind of combining that together and thinking, okay, now where does this kind of sit in the journey of trauma and healing?
Wow, that's awesome. I'm actually just starting this book now, but I heard you are also gonna, or I think it's already written, a book on self-love.
Writing at the moment.
Ooh, yeah. I'm so excited. So I'm gonna get this hook, and I'm gonna ask you, why do you think self-love is so relevant for self-development, and also how does cultivating it helps when, healing trauma and rearranging belief systems and really deep in the psychological process of individuation in the end?
I think that is such a great question, and it's a massive one, so I'm going to try and condense it. I think fundamentally, Layla, when we don't like ourselves or when we're not at peace with different aspects of ourselves, and I want to say that I think every human being fundamentally on some level is conflicted. And when you understand the idea of how different parts of us develop based on the previous experiences that we've had, you'll understand that we have many different parts in us, and a lot of them are often conflicted. And I think it's not until we really look at those shadow parts of ourselves and find a way to integrate them, and that doesn't mean that you have to like all of them, or that doesn't mean that they're all necessarily good. It's about integrating, what you might see, the light and the dark, to become more wholesome. And it's about, I think, being in kind of deep acceptance and appreciation, actually, once you grow, for the whole of yourself. So I think, first of all, that's really relevant. Now, why is self-love important? Because, we tend to be nicer to other people when we tend to be nicer to ourselves, right? When we have a certain level of self-compassion, I think that's when we tend to extend more compassion to others. Like, when I had the eating disorder, I had huge body image issues. I absolutely hated myself. I used to think I was, super ugly, and used to have a lot of body dysmorphia. And, the way I presented to the world, I was very closed. I was very, didn't really want to relate to many people. And I was actually quite judgmental of other people. And it wasn't until I started to heal that, those many years ago. Nowadays, when I tend to look at people, I tend to come, a lot of the time, not all the time, I'm going to be honest, okay? I tend to come off, for more of a kind of empathetic, compassionate space, because I think once you've kind of been through the journey yourself, you tend to look at other people through a different lens. Yeah. So self-love isn't just about, I need to love myself because, it's a buzzword. Self-love, I think, is extremely nuanced, and it really, the question we need to ask is, what has actually stopped us from loving ourselves? And that's what opens up the world to programming and previous traumas and your past belief systems. And I think that when you start to discover that shadow part of yourself and, really start to understand, it's not necessarily about, oh, I've got to do X, Y, Z and I'll love myself more. I think that can be quite superficial. But rather when you start asking the question, what's actually blocking me? Because I believe if consciousness is the ground of all being, and I believe that I really do believe that fundamentally everybody is a good person, and that there are reasons for why we behave in the way that we do. So if fundamentally we're coming from a space of love, we already are that. So it's not that we have to build self-love, or it's opening and coming home to yourself again. And for that, we need to understand what's blocking us in the first place. And that's really where the work in belief systems and energy psychology and trauma and shadow work and the mirror side, and you really start to understand it's a really deep journey fundamentally into coming home to yourself. Not only are you kinder to yourself, you're kinder to others, and I think also you become a little bit more open to where life pulls to take you. So rather than you kind of worrying about and controlling where you might want to go with life, I think it becomes more about, I've got this kind of little whisper inside of me, and if I'm just open enough and gentle enough and curious enough, I wonder where it's going to take me. So you begin to dance with life a little bit more.
That's so beautiful. Yeah. That's beautiful. And then, of course, you have many techniques like the EFT you just taught me yesterday. So that's awesome. Well, so we can wrap it up because you have a class to teach. Do you have any message to whoever's watching?
Yeah, I think life is really beautiful, and guys, figure out what is holding you back. There are loads of tools and techniques out there, and I hope it's a great journey for you along the way.
So, wow, that's beautiful, and it's deep, but it's soft, like yourself. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sweetheart.
Espero que vocês tenham gostado, espero que tenham rolado vários insights aí. E se você quiser conhecer um pouquinho mais do trabalho dela, ela dá alguns cursos no Brasil através da Quantum Academy, como eu mencionei no começo da entrevista, e ela também tem diversos livros publicados pela Editora Goya, que eu também vou deixar o link aqui na descrição para vocês. Um beijo!